What's up? For those of you that don't know, my name is Christy. I go by Kryptonite on the internet. I haven't been on here in a while. My phone's acting crazy and I can't afford to buy a new one. And you guys stole my good one. So you get what you get when you get it, and you don't pitch a fit, you know? I have been guided to come and do a series on the Constitution of the United States of America, because apparently a lot of you all, like me, were not taught this in school, and apparently most of you haven't even ever read it. So I will be reading to anyone who cares to learn from this handy dandy little pocket constitution, if you will, that I picked up from a Barnes & Noble randomly one day while browsing with my child. I'm not going to go through all of the initials because, you know, it's not like it's a work of fiction. We'll just get into it. I'm going to start with the introduction because there's some very valuable information in this, and I think it could help some people. So here we go. Introduction. Oh, that's my fan in the background. I don't know if that noise was bothering the sound or whatever. Anyway, whatever. Introduction. The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged from among old parchments or musty records. They are written, as with a sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature, by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased. Alexander Hamilton, the farmer, refuted, 1775. These documents, written on, quote, old parchments, scrolled away among, quote, musty records, remain living realities because they eloquently record the sacred rights and responsibilities of human beings. We still think about the enduring challenges of government in terms coined by the revolutionary generation of Americans. They thought more deeply and argued more vigorously about these challenges than any generation after them, leaving us a series of unprecedented experiments in nation building and constitution making. We often forget just how revolutionary apologies. The numbers distracted me. I apologize. 235 is the sync. That was my childhood street address. Look it up. It has a good meaning. Where were we? We often forget just how revolutionary the creation of the United States was. However, the Americans of that era never forgot it. Revisiting these documents enables us to grasp the American experiment's revolutionary quality. 1. The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, the central document of American political life, codifies the American political creed. To understand it, however, we must know its origins and purpose. The Declaration was the last American word in the argument between Great Britain and its American colonists. In 1763, wow, the British Empire, the most successful and the freest the world had seen, had no more loyal subjects than the colonists of the 13 mainland colonies of British North America. Within 2 years, however, the first stirrings of disagreement between Britain and the colonists began to disturb peace within the empire. 2 years after the end of the French and Indian, 7 years, war, Britain confronted massive war debts. Convinced that the colonists had had a free ride on the backs of British taxpayers, British politicians decided to redress the balance by taxing them, but the colonists protested these taxes as unconstitutional. This controversy put the nature of the British Constitution into dispute. Unlike the United States Constitution, the British Constitution is not one authoritative document framed and adopted at a specific time. Rather, it is the mass of laws, judicial decisions, documents having constitutional status, such as the Magna Carta, and customs making up or constituting the British government. Because the British Constitution is unwritten, an array of understandings of its principles could spring up. 2 of these marked out the opposing positions between the colonists and Britain. The colonists saw the British Constitution as a restraint on arbitrary power. Each of its three major institutions, the Crown, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons, had the power to check the other two. Arbitrary, unchecked power went beyond actual tyranny to include potential tyranny. That's very important. It's very important to codify ways to prevent potential tyranny. We have to anticipate people attempting to take over our government and use it for their own nefarious purposes. When Parliament made laws for the colonies as the empire's supreme authority, it was acting arbitrarily. In particular, taxation without representation was tyranny. Parliament could not tax the colonists because they could not vote for members of the House of Commons. Only the colonial legislatures could tax the colonists. By contrast, the British happily gave Parliament its role as the supreme institution in their constitutional system. Parliament had earned this role by defending liberty against the Stuart kings, Charles I and James II. My dog's a loud drinker, if you can hear that. Each member of the House of Commons represented not just those who elected him, but all the king's subjects. Under this idea of virtual representation, Parliament could tax the colonists and make laws for them, though they were not actually represented. In arguing with Britain, the 13 colonies, which previously were closer to the mother country than to one another, learned that they had a common cause, defending their liberties. This insight, fostered by the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 and the First Continental Congress of 1774, led them to see themselves as Americans. By 1776, the argument between Britain and the colonies had reached a stalemate. The British were not listening to the Americans and had sent British soldiers to bring the colonists under control. The reality of war, which began at Lexington and Concord in 1775, opened American minds to the idea of independence from Britain. That January, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, offered a powerful case for independence. Beginning by demolishing monarchy, the last linchpin of American loyalty to Britain, Paine showed that the Americans deserved independence and could win it, persuading hundreds of thousands to see independence as legitimate and desirable. 4 months later, in May 1776, the Second Continental Congress directed the colonies to frame new constitutions to replace their colonial charters. Americans' commitment to liberty, the core principle of Anglo-American constitutionalism, was pushing them out of the empire. That June, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced 3 resolutions in the Second Continental Congress, the first declaring that the colonies are of right and ought to be free. Excuse me. This is a quote. Are and of right ought to be free and independent states. On July 2nd, 1776, Congress adopted those resolutions. 2 days later, it adopted a declaration drafted by Thomas Jefferson setting forth the Americans' case against George III and for independence. The declaration looks in 2 directions at once. It looks backward as the last American word in the argument with Britain, and forward, charting the future political development of an independent America. It indicted George III because the king had spurned his last chance to avoid a breach with the colonies. Its famed preamble was key to its case against the king. Its citing of, quote-unquote, I apologize, quote, an alien... Please forgive me. Obviously I'm rusty. I haven't done this in a while. Its citing of inalienable rights and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness formed the basis on which Americans could invoke the right of revolution against the tyrant George III. And yet, the Declaration's preamble also states the principles on which Americans could build their constitutions and political systems and govern themselves. Americans have continued to invoke the Declaration to advance the cause of democracy, equal rights, and individual liberty at home and around the world. Thus, the document by which the Second Continental Congress justified declaring independence found a life of its own, as a cultural, political, and constitutional symbol, eclipsing the act it was intended to explain. Part 2. The Articles of Confederation. Just as it took time for Americans to break with Britain, it took time for them to see themselves as, in Hamilton's words in the Federalist number 85, quote, a nation without a national government, end quote, and take steps to remedy that defect. In the process, they had to prepare the political ground for governmental reform and to devise mechanisms and institutions that they wanted to assemble as a new national constitution. Beginning in 1776, Americans launched a series of experiments in state constitution making. The fruits of those experiments guided later efforts in devising and amending constitutions, including, in 1787, framing the U.S. Constitution. But in 1776, few Americans felt that they needed a national government. I missed a comma in that sentence. I'm going to read it again. My apologies. But in 1776, few Americans felt that they needed a national government. For one thing, they recalled the failure of the British Empire. For another, they were devoted to a body of principles called republicanism. Americans wanted republican government, which meant no king and no nobility. The people, the ultimate source of legitimate power, would exercise it through their elected representatives. But conventional wisdom taught that a republic could only work with a small population in a small territory. Each of the 13 states was as big as a republic could be to survive external and internal threats to its existence. Thus, it seemed unlikely that one government over all 13 states could survive and preserve liberty. In July 1776, when Congress adopted Lee's resolution for independence, they also adopted his two other resolutions. The first authorized negotiations with such European powers as France and Spain, the second called for, quote, Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, unquote. On November 15, 1777, after a year of argument, Congress sent the Articles of Confederation to the states. The Articles created a one-house confederation Congress, with each state having one vote. Most issues required a majority, and such matters as treaties needed a two-thirds vote. All 13 states had to ratify any proposed amendment. The Confederation had no independent executive or judiciary, no power to raise revenue, and no power to operate directly on individuals. How would the Confederation be financed? Because the Confederation Congress had no taxing power, it had to ask the states for money. Excuse me. With each state's share based on the value of its land. The states were to collect taxes and send the proceeds to the Confederation. Americans distrusted a strong central government, especially one with taxing power. They were fighting a revolution against one such government and were leery of trusting another. Although Congress caught up in the revolution's fervor, I apologize again. I missed a comment. Also, Congress, caught up in the revolution's fervor, believed that faith in the cause would spur the states to do what they were asked to do. If I knew how to edit these, I would, but that seems like a lot of work and I still don't get paid. No offense. It took nearly 4 years for all 13 states to ratify the Articles. Under the Articles, the United States established relations with the Netherlands, France, Morocco, Prussia, and Spain, borrowed money abroad to help finance the war, and fielded a continental army that won the war. Its diplomats won the peace, negotiating the Treaty of Paris, 1783, under which Britain recognized American independence and gave the United States all territory between the Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River. The Confederation's greatest domestic achievement had to do with those western lands. Some states claimed these lands based on colonial charters, but their claims overlapped. Other states, which had no land claims, resented that, quote, landed states had a chance to make windfall profits by selling land to settlers and investors. The, quote, landless states refused to ratify the Articles of Confederation until the landed states transferred their claims to the United States so that the nation could reap this windfall. The next problem was governing these lands. Under, quote, territorial ordinances, end quote, that Congress adopted in 1784, 1785, and 1787, these lands were organized as territories to be admitted to the Union as new states on an equal basis with the original 13, with rules for organizing local government and for public education. Slavery would not be allowed north of the Ohio River, the Northwest Territory. Thus, Congress abandoned the old model of colonialism, a mother country governing territories as colonies only in its own interests. Despite these successes, the Articles had fundamental weaknesses that threatened the Union. Also, state economic and political problems, which the Confederation could not resolve, threatened the American experiments in government. The Treaty of Paris pledged Americans to honor debts owed to British or Loyalist creditors, but the states ignored these promises. Angered, Britain refused to withdraw from the Western territories. Also, Britain, France, and Spain limited trade with the new nation. Sadly, we have a history of not paying our bills, which could not retaliate or force the lifting of these limits. Third, Spain controlled the lower Mississippi, strangling American settlements, unless American settlers swore allegiance to Spain. Again, the United States was powerless to resist. The Confederation had repeated difficulties with the states. They rarely paid what they owed, and the Confederation they rarely paid what they owed the Confederation in full or on time. Some never paid at all. They also ignored treaties with Indian nations. Many states failed to send delegates to Congress, often leaving Congress unable to function. The Confederation could not force states to meet their obligations, and it could not amend the Articles to give Congress more power. States disputed boundaries, argued over fishing rights, waged trade wars against one another, and imposed tariffs on goods imported across state lines. All to bolster their own economies at their neighbors' expense. How American. Also, settlers in frontier regions of New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, and North Carolina tried to found independent states, and Congress could not help resolve these disputes. Most alarming, turmoil between debtors and creditors convulsed many states, a problem worsened by the economic downturn of the mid-1780s. Hardest hit were farmers, who lived from harvest to harvest and could be ruined by one bad year. In Rhode Island, battles between debtor and creditor parties led to rapidly changing state laws, such as paper money laws, that helped debtors but hobbled interstate commerce and seemed to nervous creditors to attack the rights of property owners. Oh, excuse me, I read that wrong. And seemed to nervous creditors to attack the rights of private property. Same difference. Where debtors could not win relief through politics, they rebelled against what they saw as heartless creditors and an indifferent judicial system. Unfortunately, not much has changed. The most famous debtors' rebellion was Shays' Rebellion, which began in western Massachusetts. Outbreaks of debtor violence spread beyond that state, from Vermont to Virginia. By some estimates, 1/4 of the armed men of New England took part in Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, was more a symbol of revolt than an actual leader of the rebellion. He was a debt-ridden farmer who struggled to keep a roof over his family's head. In January of 1787, Massachusetts authorities, with the help of the Continental Army, put down Shays' Rebellion, but its lessons lingered. Part 3. Making of the Constitution. In the mid-1780s, Americans who thought in national terms, argued that the problems plaguing the Confederation required a revolution in government. They revived the political process that between 1765 and 1776 had created the Revolutionary Movement. In 1785, at the Mount Vernon Conference, delegates from Virginia and Maryland settled boundary disputes and navigation rights. Virginia then proposed a convention to meet at Annapolis, Maryland in September, in September 1786 to solve national commercial problems. Only delegates from Virginia, New York, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey showed up at Annapolis, but they seized the chance to redefine the American political agenda. They proposed a new convention to meet in Philadelphia in 1787, quote, to render the constitution of government adequate to the exigencies of the Union, end quote. On February 21, 1787, the Confederation Congress endorsed this proposal, but its more limited resolution, stressing revision of the Articles, clashed with the Annapolis Mandate. Of the 74 delegates from 12 states, Rhode Island refused. Only 55 showed up at the convention Only 55 showed up at the convention at some point. Some of the greatest American politicians were not there. John Adams was American minister to Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson was American minister to France. John Jay was the Confederation's Secretary for Foreign Affairs in New York City. Patrick Henry stayed in Virginia because he was uninterested in national politics, although he later claimed, quote, I smelt a rat, end quote. 5 kinds of delegates attended the convention. National heroes, George Washington of Virginia and Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, brought prestige, guaranteeing that Americans would give the convention's proposals a fair hearing. Theorists of government, such as James Madison of Virginia, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, and Alexander Hamilton of New York, brought ideas that the convention would use to frame its proposals. Elder statesmen, such as John Dickinson of Delaware and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, brought their experience, one of 2 reality checks on the convention. Advocates of local interests, such as William Patterson of New Jersey and Luther Martin of Maryland, spoke for the state's concerns, the other reality check. Finally, most delegates, such quiet men as John Blair of Virginia and Jacob Broome of Delaware, became raw material for consensus and compromise. From May 25th through May 28th, the delegates elected their president, George Washington, and their secretary, William Jackson of Georgia, and adopted rules. From May 29th, when Edmund Randolph of Virginia proposed the resolutions known as the Virginia Plan, to June 14th, the large state delegates prevailed on nearly every issue. The Virginia Plan outlined a national government with supreme legislative, executive, and judicial branches. On June 15th, the small state delegates counterattacked, backing William Patterson's New Jersey Plan, which was nothing more than a reworking of the Articles of Confederation, giving Congress more power. On June 19th, the convention reaffirmed the Virginia Plan, but large state delegates and small state delegates battled for weeks over representation in Congress. Small state delegates fought for equality of states in Congress. Large state delegates demanded representation based on population. This conflict lasted through July 16th, when the convention adopted the Great or Connecticut Compromise. Excuse me. From July 19th to July 26th, the delegates pored over the plan, tinkering and adjusting, and then recessed for a week. During the recess, Randolph prepared the Constitution's first draft, drawing on Wilson's advice. The delegates reconvened on August 6th. For the next 5 weeks, they tackled problems they had postponed, such as devising a method for choosing the president and vice president. They also adopted compromises to appease the slave states. Keep in mind that even though some of them were actually slave owners themselves, the founding fathers weren't actually necessarily all that into the idea of slavery. I'm not defending anyone, but know your history. Let's see, where was I? I apologize. From September 10th to September 12th, the Committee on Style and Arrangement drew up the Constitution's final draft, assigning this task to Governor Morris of Pennsylvania. They spelled governor with extra U's. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania. From September 12th to September 17th, the delegates moved through the last state of revision. On September 17th, 1787, 37 of the 40 delegates present voted to adopt and sign the Constitution and to send it to the Confederation Congress. No group at the convention got its way, especially not the theorists of government. Senior statesmen warned them that they were going too far and too fast. That tends to be an issue. Just like with the Lorax, sometimes I think progress progresses too fast. Localist politicians demanded fairness for state interests, and architects of compromise set their ideas aside. Nothing is more fatal to theoretical purity than the spirit of compromise. The convention made a vitally important shift from devising the best constitution possible in theory to devising the best that had a chance to be adopted. Because sometimes our ideas work really well inside of our minds, but putting them into practice, into practical reality, they don't necessarily work the way they do in our minds. Sometimes they have to be tweaked a little, and that's why it takes a collective. That's why we don't want a dictatorship, because a dictator might have some really good ideas, but they might have some really bad ones too. And if you have to implement them exactly as that one individual wants them implemented with no regard to common sense or how things might play out in the long run, you can run into a lot of problems. What kind of document did this process produce? The Constitution creates a government of 3 branches with limited but generous grants of power to operate directly on individual citizens. The House of Representatives represents the people, and each state has equal representation in the Senate. The president is elected indirectly by an electoral college mixing national and federal elements. His powers, largely undefined, strike a balance between the good example of George Washington and the bad example of George III. The Constitution leaves the federal judiciary structure to Congress. Although it includes compromise clauses dealing with slavery, the words slavery and slave appear nowhere in the document, because the framers hoped that future generations would find a solution to slavery or that slavery would die out. Now, again, not excusing anyone, but just to be accurate for the sake of history, their intention was, I believe, to utilize these humans who unfortunately had been sold as slaves, because at the time that was a thing that was happening, and that's what it was, to get the work done necessary to get the nation started, and then I would assume grant them their citizenship, their freedom to a certain extent. Again, not defending any of these people, because their ideas on certain things were very, they were coming from a very, let's say, pro-male, for sure, pro-white, but not even just white, like very specific Anglo-Saxon origins white. And, you know, they wanted a specific type of man to have all the power, but also they wanted a semblance of freedom for others. So it's like these ideals that had been ingrained as a result of where they came from and the belief systems that, you know, that they grew up in, that were handed down, you know, that even still permeate to this day. In their own minds, though, they thought that this was the way it was supposed to be, but they thought that they were actually being more generous, more helpful, more beneficial to the people that they kind of saw as beneath them, if that makes sense. Again, not defending, just adding context. Let's see, where were we? The amending process codified in Article 5 is easier to work than was Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation. And Article 6's Supremacy Clause makes the Constitution the supreme law of the land and empowers federal courts to interpret it as a part of their duties. Finally, because of fatigue and the belief, as Roger Sherman said, that it would be, quote, unnecessary, the original Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. That turned out to be a fateful decision. Article 7 set forth the process for adopting the Constitution. Each state would elect a ratifying convention. If 9 of the 13 state conventions, 2/3, ratified it, it would go into effect as the new government of the United States. Pardon me. 2/3 was easier to achieve than the unanimous consent required by Article 13. Also, the ratifying conventions were more likely than the state legislatures to consider the Constitution on its merits. The legislatures, jealous of their power, would resist any attempt to shift power to the general government. Finally, because the Constitution would be the government of the American people, only they, not the states, had the power to form such a government. On September 26 through 28, 1787, the Confederation Congress debated the Constitution. Its opponents failed to persuade Congress to rewrite it or reject it as exceeding the convention's power, and its supporters failed to get Congress to endorse it. Instead, Congress silently forwarded the Constitution to the states, thus implying that the Constitution was legitimate. The ratification controversy was the supreme display of American political creativity. That's a polite way of putting it. It operated on 2 interacting levels. On the formal level, the Confederation Congress sent the Constitution to the state legislatures, which called elections for ratifying conventions, which deliberated on ratifying the Constitution. On the informal level, a vigorous argument over the Constitution raged through the nation, in newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, and rallies. The informal argument may have been the more important level, for it launched American constitutional discourse, the ongoing shared argument among the people about the Constitution's origins, significance, meaning, and applications, and helped to create a national political community focusing the people's attention on the political element of their national identity. Who supported the Constitution under the name Federalists? Who opposed it, known to posterity as Anti-Federalists? Some scholars argue that rich people tended to support the Constitution and poor or working class people tended to oppose it. Or that city dwellers supported the Constitution and farmers opposed it. Both these distinctions fail. Modern scholars suggest that the national issue of ratification interacted in each state with pre-existing divisions of state politics to produce a crazy quilt of shifting alliances and loyalties. They focus on tracing links between anti-federalist and federalist understandings of politics and society and their positions in the Constitution. Anti-federalists insisted that the convention exceeded its mandate by writing a new constitution instead of revising the articles. Federalists retorted that Congress and the states had accepted the Constitution's legitimacy. Thus, the issue was moot. Also, in the Federalist No. 40, Madison invoked the right of revolution in the Declaration of Independence. He pointed out that a government too weak to safeguard the revolution was as threatening to liberty as a government that might be too strong. Very true. Second, the two sides disagreed on the nature of the Union and the relationship between the Union and the states. Anti-federalists feared that the general government would swallow up the states, destroying the people's right of self-government. Federalists, citing the history of the Confederation, insisted that the states would infringe on the general government's powers as they had with the Confederation. Also, they argued that only a government at least as strong as that outlined in the Constitution could protect the general good and the people's liberties. Otherwise, the Union would break into separate confederacies, which, some Federalists charged, was what Anti-Federalists had in mind. Denying that they wanted to break up the Union, Anti-Federalists insisted that, even if the Confederation was too weak to safeguard American interests, the Constitution still was too dangerous. Third, Anti-Federalists denounced the Constitution's system of representation as inadequate. They mocked the House of Representatives and the Senate as too small by comparison with the large state legislatures. They argued that this unjust scheme of representation would limit service in Congress to powerful, wealthy men. Federalists retorted that the Constitution's scheme of representation was designed to choose men of enlarged views who could grasp the nation's interests. Clearly that failed. Moreover, reapportionment would expand the House beyond its original size. Finally, Congress's powers were limited to avoid infringing the people's rights and the state's legitimate powers, yet extensive enough to safeguard the general good. Anti-Federalists, distrusting the presidency, charged that the president was not accountable, that impeachment was too difficult to use against him, and that he would work to ensure his repeated re-election for life. Federalists retorted that the president would be accountable because he could not hide behind advisors, that his brief term of office would not make him a king, and that the Electoral College would choose the best man for the job. Clearly, that has not happened. No offense, but more often than not, it feels like they get it wrong. Anti-Federalists denounced federal courts as unnecessary and expensive. They worried that federal courts would swallow up state courts, wiping out distinctions between state laws and leaving the people subject to a tyrannous federal bench. They also decried the lack of trial by jury in civil cases. In response, Federalists justified the federal judiciary as a bulwark of liberty that would defend the Constitution against unconstitutional acts of the national legislature or executive, and vindicate the Constitution and the general government against encroachments by the states. Please pardon me, I was going to say lubricate my throat, but that sounds gross. I didn't mean it that way. Anti-Federalists found the Constitution's lack of a Bill of Rights their most powerful argument. Even many who backed the Constitution objected to its lack of a Bill of Rights. Jefferson scolded Madison. Quote, "A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inference." End quote. Federalists argued that a Bill of Rights was not needed because the Constitution gave the federal government no power over rights. They also noted, as Hamilton insisted in the Federalist number 84, that the Constitution itself was a Bill of Rights. But, aware that they were vulnerable on this issue, they began to rethink their position. Federalists praised the Constitution's amending process, Article 5. It would be easier to use than Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation, but it also would bolster the Constitution as a fundamental law that should not be lightly altered. Article 5's blend of national and federal elements, as Madison noted in the Federalist number 39, proved that the Constitution would neither destroy the states nor be at their mercy. Other issues came up as well. Anti-Federalists objected to the clause authorizing a permanent capital, which would become a citadel where the people's enemies would shelter themselves against the people's wrath. Federalists highlighted the humiliating journeys of the Continental and Confederation Congresses from city to city during and after the Revolution. A new nation required the stability of a permanent capital. New England anti-federalists denounced the Constitution's ban on religious tests for voting or holding office, fretting that a Jew, a Turk, or an infidel could become president. Federalists extolled this ban as a bulwark of religious liberty. Anti-federalists in New England also denounced the Constitution's slavery clauses, but Southern Federalists praised them. The Constitution's amending process played a vital role in its victory. At the outset, some Federalists insisted that the Constitution had to be amended before they would accept it, drafting lists of previous amendments, quote, previous amendments, end quote. Other anti-Federalists were willing to adopt the Constitution, but only with added, quote, conditional amendments, end quote. By contrast, Federalists insisted that the Constitution had to be adopted or rejected without amendments. In February 1788, the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention found a sensible compromise. Anti-Federalists would prepare a list of, quote, recommended amendments, end quote, to be sent to the first Congress to meet under the Constitution. The Federalists pledged to back such amendments. This device of recommended amendments became the key to the Constitution's victory. All states after Massachusetts, except Maryland, added lists of recommended amendments to their resolutions or ratification. These lists were the raw material from which Madison drew his list of proposed amendments that he offered in the House of Representatives of the First Congress on June 8, 1789. 10 of those amendments were ratified in 1791, becoming the Bill of Rights. Part 4. Constitutional change. Americans have shaped their lives through law, and for more than 200 years, the Constitution has been the core of the nation's law. We make many demands on the Constitution. It sets forth our government structure, allocates powers and duties among our public institutions and officials, and defines our rights and responsibilities. Just as important, the Constitution declares the nation's central principles, the goals for which we came together as a nation, the purposes of its grants of power and limits on power, and the kinds of public and private lives that we want to foster under its protection. The Constitution changes over time in 3 major ways. The most sweeping is, quote, formal constitutional change, end quote, using Article 5's amending process to add provisions to the Constitution. Formal constitutional change alters the document's form by a method of lawmaking more formal and difficult to use than ordinary lawmaking. To become part of the Constitution, a proposed amendment must win a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress and then be ratified by 3/4 of the states, 38 out of 50. More than 12,000 amendments have been proposed since 1789, but Congress has proposed only 33 to the states, and only 27 have been adopted. Constitutional amendments fall into one of 3 categories. The first group, such as the first 10, the Bill of Rights, protects fundamental principles of liberty and self-government. Some, the Civil War Amendments 13, 14, and 15, extend protections of liberty in ways either not imagined by the Constitution's framers and ratifiers or developing their efforts. The second group, such as that providing that senators be elected by each state's voters, 17, these are Roman numerals, so it takes a second to process, or the Voting Rights Amendments 15, 19, 23, and 25, and 26, expands democracy as a core component of the constitutional system. And the third group, such as those dealing with the Electoral College, presidential terms of office, and presidential succession and disability, 12, 22, 25, repairs defects of the original Constitution or responds to problems not envisioned by the Constitution's framers and ratifiers. The second way of changing the Constitution is judicial interpretation. Courts must apply the Constitution's provisions to changing times and circumstances. That is why Edmund Randolph, who prepared the first draft of the Constitution in August of 1787, excuse me, someone really doesn't want me to read this today, do they? 1 second. you don't want to hear it, just don't watch. Wrote that he had to draft the Constitution in general terms. Such powerful phrases as commerce among the several states, quote, commerce among the several states, freedom of speech, cruel and unusual punishment, and equal protection of the laws, end quote, change meaning over time as new problems arise and people devise new responses to old problems. Each branch of the federal government and state and local officials must interpret the Constitution, but our system gives special weight to the interpretation set forth by federal courts, especially the United States Supreme Court. Some of the pivotal moments of American history have come when the Supreme Court has had to interpret the Constitution to deal with a divisive issue, I don't know, like the EULA maybe. It doesn't seem divisive, but it is. It's just hidden, right? Or to resolve a controversy between the other branches of government. For example, in 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney seized the opportunity to interpret the Constitution authoritatively to resolve issues concerning slavery. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, Taney ruled that the federal government had no power to limit slavery's spread into the territories. Imagine fighting for access to slavery. Like that blows my mind. Like, imagine being upset that the Constitution doesn't allow you to expand slavery. Like, that's wild to me, but okay. The public outcry over this decision helped to bring on the Civil War 4 years later. Now, keep that in mind. The public outcry over this decision helped to bring on the Civil War 4 years later. So when they tell you that the Civil War was about states' rights, keep in mind that it was about states' rights to expand slavery.